Okay, great. All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Ellen Boyle. I am the marketing librarian here at the Wilmington Memorial Library, and we have a very special guest tonight for Women's History Month. Yesterday was International Women's Day. We're talking about the gender wage gap tonight. We have Dr. Debra Michals with us, who is the Director of Women's and Gender Studies at Merrimack College. And then before we get started, I just want to go through some Zoom rules. I know a bunch of you have probably already been to a lot more Zooms than you would like to admit, but we could all use some reminders. So we are actually in a webinar format right now. So we cannot see you. I have the ability to unmute you if I would like to. But for the most part, please direct your questions to the chat. We will have time at the end for questions. So if you can save them until the end, that would be great. But if you have something during the course of Dr. Michals' talk, please type it in the chat and I will interrupt her and address the question. All right, I think that's all. So whenever you're ready.
Sounds great. Thank you, Ellen. Today, I'm here to talk to you about the gender pay gap, what it is, why it persists, its history and its roots, as well as future issues surrounding the gender pay gap. What is the gender pay gap? Basically, it is it's defined as the difference between the median earnings of men and women, the median earnings of men compared to women, or women compared to men. So what we mean when we say the gender pay gap is that women earn so much per every dollar that a man earns. I'm going to share my screen with you and just kind of run through some of the data on the gender pay gap. So as I said, it's the systemic differences between the average wages and salaries that a woman earns compared to those of men. And just to give you kind of a real sense of what that is, this is white women. We'll start with white women's earnings compared to white men's earnings. So for every dollar a white man earns, on average, a woman earns about 79 or 80 cents. That will vary depending on the state she lives in. It'll vary depending on her educational level, her age, all of which I'm going to run through in a minute. But as you can see from this graphic, the gender wage gap widens for women of color. Black women, for example, earn about 62 cents for every dollar that a white man earns. And Latinas earn about 54 cents, Native American women, 57 cents. If this is just another way of sort of looking at the same data. And the reason I wanted to show this to you in two different formats is that when you look at women's wages compared to men in a chart like this, you can really see how they come together by race. What does that mean annually? That means for every $55,000 a year that a white man earns, a white woman earns $43,000, a Black woman earns $35,000, and a Hispanic woman earns $30,000 a year. This is how the gender wage gap shakes out based on educational level. This is something that, so we see it at every level. For women and men who don't have a high school diploma, men will earn $25,000 a year to $16,000 a year that a woman would earn. You get all the way to college level and you see the average man earns $63,000 a year to the $43,000 a year women earn. And then of course at graduate level, people who have more advanced degrees, you see the gap is even wider. Now we see, again, this is another way of looking at this. This is weekly earnings for people at all educational levels versus less than a high school diploma, $418 a week for women versus $520 a week for men, all the way down the list. If you get a bachelor degree or higher, women will earn $1,000 a week for the $1,400 a week that men earn. The gender wage gap varies by state. So if you look at this graphic, for example, In Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, the wage gap is much narrower. Women earn about 91% or 91 cents on the dollar that every man earns. Here in Massachusetts, our wage gap is about 82 cents for every dollar that a white man earns. But if you notice lower on the chart, oops, sorry, you'll see states like Montana, North Dakota, Utah, West Virginia, where the wage gap is considerably wider, that in Louisiana, women earn 66 cents for every dollar that a man earns. The wage gap is even more significant for women who earn minimum wage. And this has been coming up in our world a lot lately, right? You've been hearing Congress discussing whether or not to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Why is this a gender issue? Because 2/3 of all minimum wage workers are women. Women are also 72% of all people who earn tips when they work. And again, if we look at some of the service workers, again, at the bottom, it says 70% of all restaurant servers who are almost 3 times as likely than other workers to live in poverty. Here's another reason why the minimum wage is an issue for the gender wage gap. In states where the minimum wage is at or above $8.25 an hour, the wage gap is actually as much as 41% smaller than it is where people earn below $8.25 an hour. So this is, again, something that's been coming up in our world, and we'll circle back to it again in a bit. When you talk about the gender wage gap, sometimes people who are detractors or naysayers about it will say, oh, well, that's because women, we're comparing apples to oranges. Women are more likely to work part-time. It's not true. The gender wage gap statistics are actually based on equal full-time workers. But here's what we do know. The gender wage gap is so pronounced that it even happens in female-dominated professions. So these are some of the top professions that tend to be occupied predominantly by women, whether we're talking about social workers, housekeepers, secretaries, or administrative assistants, nurses. You still see a wage gap, which is anywhere from 18 cents on the dollar. In other words, women earning 82 cents for every dollar a man earns as a social worker, to much, much more in other professions. So even in female-dominated professions, men seem to earn more. The last graphic around all of this that I wanted to show you is the devaluation of sort of women's work. The fastest growing female-dominated categories in America today all pay less than $15 an hour. And this graphic shows you what they are, everything from office clerks to medical assistants to personal home and healthcare aides, and so forth. If you look down the list, almost all of these fast-growing categories pay much less than $15 an hour. Whereas if you look at the fastest growing categories that men work in, they tend to be things like engineering, computer science, and so forth, pay much, much more than that. I want to talk in a minute about the causes of the gender pay gap, but one of the other points I want to make is that even in certain professions, like right now, we know that 37% of all doctors are women. That's a major increase from past decades. But what categories of medical practice women go into tend not to be the categories that men are in. So for example, women are only 15% of cardiologists, but they're 58% of OBGYN doctors and 65% of pediatric doctors. Well, cardiologists and orthopedists, for example, where women are only 6%, those are among the highest paying professions in the medical field. And of course, pediatrics and OBGYN are among the lowest paying. And we can talk in a minute about why that is, why women go into those professions and why they are paid so low. And it's kind of happening at both levels. So what are the causes of the gender pay gap? Excuse me, just a moment. I'm having a screen share issue. Okay. So the causes of the gender pay gap are a variety of things. Persistent discrimination, so bias against women, bias against people of color. The job categories that women go into are undervalued or underpaid, um, largely in many cases because they're things women do. And finally, there's the not negotiating part. One of the reasons the gender pay gap exists is frankly because women tend to be less likely than men to negotiate salaries. We know, for example, that statistically, women and men begin after college, begin at roughly the same level in terms of their pay. And the gap widens as they begin from their first job forward. So here are some of the costs of not negotiating. We know, for example, that the starting salaries that men earn are $4,000 more or 7.6% above women. That 9 times as many men as women ask for more money than they're offered in the first job. That men tend to ask 2 to 3 times more often than women do. That women, if they're going to negotiate, they will plan it further ahead, 1 month, for example, versus 1 week for men. We know that 20% of women say they will never and have never negotiated their salaries at all. Women also report salary expectations that are 3 to 34% lower than what men expect for the same job. Women's estimates of a fair salary were 4% lower than men's for first jobs and 22% lower for career peak. And what we mean by that is when they've reached that peak moment in their careers. So you can see how our own sort of gendering, the way we learn to be women and men, has an impact on what we're willing to do when it comes to negotiating. We know, for example, that women are socialized to be nice, to try to get along, to make their relationships the most important part of their lives. We know, for example, that women worry more about the impact of their actions on their relationships. So women tend to protect their relationships, their personal connections. And one of the ways they do that in a job situation is frankly by not asking for more. That women are worried about being seen as ungrateful. And we know, for example, that when women get a job, they are so happy to get a job, to be asked. They also underestimate what their skills are worth. They tend to perceive that the circumstances are fixed and absolute, that there is no room for negotiating, that this is the salary I was offered, so this is what I get. They assume someone else is in control, which is something women learn from birth, and that if they bide their time, perhaps they'll be seen and be rewarded. Women also learn to focus more on what they need versus what they're worth. This is a big factor. Do I need more than this? Well, I don't want to make waves. I don't want to negotiate because I don't want them to perceive that I'm not grateful for this or that I'm greedy. These are not things that men think about when they are offered a job. One thing I know that comes up a lot in my classes with students is they will say, if I get that first job and I ask for more money, I'm afraid they'll withdraw the offer. And that fear, I think, is something that is part of our gender socialization, that as women, we learn to not make waves, to be nice, and we fear if we aren't nice, there'll be consequences. I think that's where that comment about will they take the job offer back. Men, on the other hand, are socialized to conquer, and they believe that there are opportunities to be had for the asking. That in one study, for example, 70% of the men felt more entitled to more money than the women in the same exact survey. So going back to some of the consequences of this, hang on. A woman who routinely negotiates her salary will earn over $1 million more by the time she retires than a woman who accepts what she's offered without asking for more. Just let that hang in the air there for a minute. $1 million by the time she retires. And the reason for that is that when you negotiate in your first job, you've already upped your salary level. And if you continue to negotiate at at each subsequent job, your earnings continue to grow. So negotiating on your very first job means you can earn $500,000 more by the end of your career. This matters because what you earn is really linked to the benefits that you get in life, to your Social Security, the IRA contributions. All of these are income-based. So if you start low, you stay low. Here's one example of how early on, even children recognize the consequences of all of this. One study asked sixth graders what the world would be like if they were the opposite gender. The boys said very disparaging have to kinds of things, like if I were a girl, I'd have to help mom cook, or I'd have to worry about getting pregnant or how I look in clothes. And the girls all said very liberating things like, I'd get to stay out later and I'd have more freedom. Both of those are examples of how we really do sort of learn gender socialization at a very young age. What is the history of the Gender Pay Act? I mean, of gender inequality in terms of our pay? Just a moment, I'm having some technical difficulties. There we go. So am I still screen sharing here, Ellen?
You are not.
Okay, good. Great. So what are the roots of this? Why do we have this Gender Pay Act? I mean, why do we have this gender pay gap? What is the root of this inequality? It kind of goes back, way back in history, to when the United States first began to industrialize. Before that, we were a farm-based economy. And when the US was based on farms, every member of the family's contributions mattered. So, because if women didn't contribute, if children didn't contribute, the family would not survive economically. But when the United States began industrializing, and when the United States developed this ideology of public spaces or spheres for men and private spheres are for women, meaning women would take care of home and family and men would go out and earn cash. When men began earning cash, everything women normally did as part of the farm economy was seen as what women do because they are women, and therefore had no cash value to it. It became connected to the very essence of being female. That, in addition to that, fears that if women had their own salaries, their own ability to support themselves, this is again in the 19th century, they would never marry and never have families. So women's salaries were kept low on the idea that they would need to marry to support themselves economically, and therefore they would only work until they were able to get married. So work was seen as something women did temporarily, not as a way of surviving. And yet, even as all this is happening, of course, we always have single mothers and we always have women who need to work. The pay gap at the beginning of the 20th century was around 45, 50% of what that women earned, about that in comparison to what men earned. In World War II, when World War II broke out and men went off to battle, and women, as you all know, were recruited to be the Rosie the Riveters who came and took those men's jobs and helped build the war machines and kept the economy going, men in the unions in particular started to argue for women to be paid the same as men. And I'm going to ask you to think about for a minute, why would men advocate for women to be paid the same as them for the first time in history in the 1940s when the US is at war? I'm going to pause while you think about it. The answer is probably not what you think. The real answer is that men were afraid that women would depress the wages, that by having women do the jobs that men did while they were away at war, that wages, if they weren't paid at men's rates, wages would be lowered to women's rates, so that when the men came back from battle and tried to get their jobs back, they would be paid much less money. So it's the men who are advocating for the first moment in history for women to be paid equally were not necessarily doing it because they really wanted to see women earn what men earn. The first moment of a gender pay law in the United States comes in 1963, and it's the Equal Pay Act of 1963. The Equal Pay Act argued that women and men should be paid equally for the same work. There were lots of folks who wanted to include a comparable worth component to that law, meaning that women and men who do comparable jobs or jobs of comparable worth should be paid the same. But that was not included in the original Equal Pay Act of 1963. The Equal Pay Act was a product of the President's Commission on the Status of Women under John F. Kennedy, which outlined, frankly, many of the discriminations and biases we still see today. And the product, of course, was the Equal Pay Act. But in 1963, there were not that many women who had the same jobs as men, frankly. So it didn't have quite the teeth that it would later have. The other issue with the Equal Pay Act was that if you were being paid unequally, you had 180 days to report that you were being paid unfairly. But as you all know, and I know, most of us don't discover we're being paid unfairly within the first 180 days of being hired. Sometimes it might take many, many years to discover that the person sitting next to you who does the exact same job as you is being paid far better simply because they're male. So that was a kind of loophole in that Equal Pay Act. And it doesn't get fixed until 2009 under President Obama, when we get the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. You've probably all heard of that. But what the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act does is it requires the clock to restart every 180 days. So in other words, if you are being discriminated against under the old Equal Pay Act, you only had 180 days or 6 months from when the violation first occurred, which is when you were hired or when the man was hired who works next to you. Under the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009, that clock restarts every 180 days. Lilly Ledbetter was a woman who worked for the auto industry for many years, and 19 years into her job, discovered she was being paid unfairly. But because of the old Equal Pay Act loophole, she could not do anything about it. And hence the law is named for her. And you see the beginnings of some change. The other really important piece of legislation for gender discrimination is, of course, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that law basically said that it's illegal for companies to discriminate in employment on the basis of race, sex, religion, and national origin. And and in summer of 2020, the Supreme Court added to that coverage, made those who are LGBTQ also covered by that. So those are some of the protections that we've had for many years. I mean, because of those laws, but still, of course, right, we have the persistence of inequality in pay. Massachusetts in 2018 passed what is one of the most progressive laws in the country when it comes to gender pay equity. And what our law says is this. So there's a couple of quick things. First of all, we have a great history where this is concerned. In 1945, we're the first state in the country to pass an equal pay law. But that's because of all of the things I've already mentioned, that the gap continues, of course, because it does not look across categories. In July 2018, there's a new law that is passed, and it is one of the most radical and most progressive in the country, and really will do the most to, I think, eradicate some of the issues that we have. I'm going to put on a short video with Attorney General Maura Healey explaining the law, and then I'm going to go into some of the details about what makes the Massachusetts law unique and important.
Equal pay is the law in Massachusetts. But for too long, the gender pay gap has cost women billions in lost wages. On July 1st, a new law took effect that makes sure women are paid the same as men. Here's how it works. Equal pay for comparable work. If your job requires similar skill, effort, and responsibility as someone else, you can't be paid less because of your gender. Salary history. From now on, employers cannot ask about your salary history before making a job offer. That's a big deal. For most women, the gender pay gap starts early in their career. And too often, employers make salary decisions based on what you were paid before. We're ending that cycle of discrimination. The last point is simple. The best way to stop discriminatory pay is to talk about it. Now the law protects your right to talk about your wages with your coworkers. So please share this video. Make sure everyone knows about their rights under the new equal pay law. And if you face discrimination at work, we can help. Thank you.
So that's really significant. The Massachusetts law does a couple of things that most other equal pay laws don't do. It pays people for jobs of comparable worth, which is what they tried to do in 1963, but didn't actually accomplish. So if you're doing something very similar to a coworker that doesn't have the same title, because that's usually, right, one of the ways you can get around this is say, well, your title is different than his. Well, if you're doing the same work, or regardless of your title, you need to be paid the same. That's the first thing it did. And the second thing that makes the Massachusetts pay law really radical is that employers cannot ask your past employer what you earned. This matters because one of the reasons the gender pay gap continues to exist is that the increase you get in your next job is based on what you made in your last job. So if you are applying for a job and you're earning $50,000 a year right now, but the job is in a category where you could be making $70,000 to $80,000 a year, under the old law, they could ask your employer, and if you're making 50, they're probably going to offer you 55 or 60. And you see how that continues the gender pay gap, because you could have been making 70 to 80, but they asked your former employer and then just decided to kind of bump you up a little bit. Under this law, they can't ask. What that means is they have to give you the option to negotiate for what the job is actually worth. If they can't ask about your past, then they can't give you a salary based on your past. It gives you the opportunity to say, a job like this is worth 70 to 80, I want 70 to 80. Second thing, that a way that companies have prevented women from closing the gap on the gender pay inequity has been by making policies that say you cannot discuss with colleagues what you are earning. Massachusetts says you can't prohibit that. So another way you today, living and working in Massachusetts, can in fact ensure or help ensure to narrow the gender wage gap is by asking your colleagues what you earn. That is one of the ways people figure out that they're being underpaid. And in the past, companies have said, we don't do that. We can let you go for that kind of behavior. Not in Massachusetts, not anymore. So these are important tools that you have as workers and that the state has to further ensure that we narrow this pay gap. I'd like to sort of wrap up by talking about the world we're all living in right now, which is, of course, the age of the COVID pandemic. COVID has made a major, has going to have, I think, a negative impact on efforts to close the wage gap. Since the 1970s, we've seen the wage gap narrowing. We've seen it go from 59 cents in the late 1960s to 80 or 81 or 82 cents on the dollar today. But in the last month alone, in January alone, 270,000 women left the workforce compared to just 71,000 men. The number of women who have been pushed out of jobs either because they work in industries like the hotel and restaurant industry and in education where jobs have disappeared, or because they're feeling the pressure of educating children at home and have voluntarily left the workforce, has resulted in a really major trend that is going to be problematic for the future for this conversation about the gender pay gap. We know, for example, that 4 times as many women as men dropped out of the labor force in September alone, roughly 865,000 women compared to 216,000 men. And much of this has to do with the lack of available childcare, the need to educate children. And so, and for women of color, for example, who many of them work in some of the industries hardest hit, those numbers are also very high. Why does this matter for the gender wage gap? Well, we know that women who take just 1 year out of the workforce had annual earnings that were 39% lower than women who did not leave the workforce. So even taking a year out of your career to have a child or because of this pandemic is going to have a significant impact on your ability to get back into the job market at the level at which you were previously working. Right now, it remains to be seen whether some of these women return to the workforce, whether they're able to return to the workforce in the same place, or whether we're going to see kind of a widening of the wage gap in the future. So I'll pause there and open up for questions if people have questions. Ellen, are we seeing any questions or comments?
Yeah, not yet. If anybody wants to talk, you could raise your hand. Oh, I think, okay, someone's raising their hand. Okay, Amy, I'm gonna allow you to talk.
I can barely hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, I can hear you now.
We're talking about a lot of times how women are afraid to ask for a raise, or they don't stand up for themselves as much in the workplace. What would your advice be that inferior and in the workplace or when asking for a raise?
Okay, think the question, because you're breaking up a little bit, I think you're asking me what kind of advice I would give people to advocate for themselves in the workplace. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not a counselor, although I play one on TV. No, I'm not a counselor, but I think, honestly, I can tell you from my own experience and that women are socialized from decades ago, not even, just in the present. We don't like to talk about money, right? We knew more about the sort of, more about the private lives of the Clintons when they were having all of their problems than we've ever learned about their financial lives, right? We are always uncomfortable talking about money, and women learned this very early on at a very young age. When I was first doing any kind of consulting work, it was really difficult for me to talk about money. And yet I'm paid by the project, right? So how do I make a good living if I'm uncomfortable? And here I am, somebody who knows this stuff, right? I know this stuff and I am uncomfortable talking about money. I actually had found myself using euphemisms for money, like what is the fee? What's your budget for this project? Rather than just simply saying, here's what I'd like to earn. I think that my advice to as young women especially, but to all women is to realize that this is not personal. And I think women are socialized in many ways to make every relationship personal, but business isn't personal. And so you have to depersonalize this and not think about whether people like you or whether they think badly. I think women are always afraid of being called the B word, right? That if we assert ourselves, if we know what we are worth, if we are confident, we are automatically labeled the B word. And that somehow has us scampering off into a corner. I think it's about being confident and knowing what you're worth. So if you do your homework ahead of time and you research what an entry-level job or whatever level you're at in your career should pay, and you go in saying, this is what I'm worth, I would like to earn this, and here's why I think I'm worth it. I have this experience and that experience, and I know what jobs like this should pay. I think people respect that. Look, a business is always going to try to get you as cheaply as possible, and women make it way too easy for companies to get them cheap. So I'll tell you what I do. I square my shoulders back nice and straight and tall. I sit up and I just say, you got this. You go in there and you ask for what you're worth. And I think that's what it's about. It's about doing your homework and knowing what you're worth, and just not making it personal, realizing that if they can get you cheap, they're going to, and don't let them. I hope that helps. Do we have some other questions?
Yes, we have a few. What is the impact on staying with the same company versus changing every few years? My assumption is this lessens the ability to try to close the gap. What's your take on this?
It lessens the ability. I wonder why you think it lessens the ability. Let me think about this for a minute. I think that generally speaking, I think it's interesting, Angela, that you think this lessens the ability. And I would love if you could type in why you think that is, or if you want to jump in and say, I think in many cases, there you are. I think in many cases, honestly, people traditionally assume that you get more money each time you change jobs.
Yeah, exactly. What I was meaning is, by staying with one company for a long period of time, you lessen the ability to make more money, because it's harder to get those larger pay increases that you get with changing jobs. And actually there's a follow-up question to that in terms of, and I know you said you're not, a executive coach that can help coach people through that, but when you're with a company trying to get those increases, right? And I'm curious, as this study, if it looked at what the increase, like raises, male versus female over the years of employment too, because that would be an interesting thing to think about, right? So yeah, I stay with a company for a long period of time, and then I continue to get less of an increase than the male that's next to me that's doing the same job.
I think I think what happens in that case is that if you started and you stay basically in the same position, and that's the other piece of this, right? Is that if you're staying roughly in the same job and you're there for 10 years, you're right. I mean, if you started low, you're probably going to stay. The differentials aren't going to narrow the way that we'd like them to. I think that if you are promoted, or if you're both promoted, right, that's your opportunity to do some negotiating. And almost in that moment, there's this almost a similar opportunity to when you switch jobs. But you're right. I think that the raises you get are going to be based on whatever you started at. And for, unless you have a good sponsor or mentor in the company who's advocating for you, the odds are that in the same job, you're going to, you'll get 5 and he'll get 5% increase, but he started 20% above you. So he's always going to be there unless there's an opportunity for a promotion. On the other hand, your assumption that yes, you can close the gap better when you switch companies. Absolutely. And if you're within Massachusetts with this new law, and it's only a couple years old, you have real differences.
Yeah. And just one last comment to that is, I thought your statistic about making $1 million more over the course of a woman's career, I think, I can't remember the exact verbiage there, but I think that is directly impacted by changing jobs, or like you said, getting a promotion and negotiating during a promotion. Like, I think a lot of, I know for myself, I don't think I would have even thought to negotiate my salary during a promotion, just be grateful for what they're giving me, right?
You learned your gender well.
Oh, I did.
Yeah, I mean, men, honestly, they will ask for so much more. I had a student years ago. I don't know if she's in on this call or not, but I've taught this at Merrimack College in a course on women in business. And when I had them, there were a couple of great books on the subject. And this one student, she raised her hand. She said, "This just doesn't feel current at all. This doesn't happen anymore." I love when students say that. And then, I said to her, look, if you don't ask, you're going to leave $1 million on the table over the course of your life. And she just didn't believe it. Well, she wrote to me after she graduated from college. She got her first job. She negotiated, and she was going into the accounting field. She negotiated 20% more than the salary they offered her. She got them to pay for her CPA exams. She got them to give her a bonus of $5,000 every time she passed her CPA or one of her many exams, all because she asked at the beginning. She's doing very well. But I don't know that she would have negotiated this way if she had not had this conversation, because we're just, most of us get a job and we say, thank you very much. We're just happy to be liked.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you're right though. If the more you move around, the more opportunity you have to bump it up. But I think it's really important for people to know what the jobs pay in that field, in whatever field you're in, at whatever level you're at, beginning of your career, middle of your career, end of your career. And that information is all on Google. So if you go in saying, and this is what Maura Healey wants us all to do, she wants us to go in when we get offered a job and they say, what are you looking to earn? She does not want you to say, well, I'm currently earning $50,000 a year. She wants you to say, a job like this, with my experience, is worth $80,000 a year. That's what I'm worth. So, other questions?
I have a question. This one is from Barbara. Do you want to jump in and ask it?
Say it again.
You want to ask your question?
Yeah. Hey, Dr. Michals, this is your cousin, Dr. Walsh. And
yes, I know.
I think this is an incredible, incredible talk. And I have to be honest, as a physician in medicine, I was disheartened to see that statistic that the higher educated you are, the larger the wage gap is. And I thought about my own experiences. And one of the things, at least in medicine for myself, no one ever teaches you how to negotiate a contract, how to talk about cost or money, or what you're worth, your skill set. And like what is available out there right now for kids entering the workforce? Because I feel like that's something that hugely lacked in my education at every single level.
That's a really interesting point, because I don't think young men get any training either, but they really do have, there's so much research on this. Their sense of what they're worth is so much higher than it is for young women when they graduate. So they just kind of go in and figure, what do I have to lose? And they ask for it. Their confidence level is really different. I don't think anybody gets this training, but I do know that colleges more and more, if you use your career centers, I know Merrimack College, where I work, our office, our career center helps students prepare for interviews and even helps them address questions of how to negotiate. And I think colleges are more and more doing this. I think what we need to do more and more of is have seminars for young women, because part of what we have to overcome as women when we negotiate is all that gender programming that we learn about what it means to be nice and to be liked, and how important it is all the time to avoid at all costs being seen as tough, aggressive, assertive. Again, I'm going back to the B word here, because that's all of what that gets labeled as. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. Like I said, I'm seeing colleges offer some trainings. I don't know that women are availing themselves of those trainings, which is a separate issue.
And I think, to speak further to that, I'm someone who's mid-career at my academic institution, and I've done a lot, and I never think I sell myself as well as I should. And I don't even think that they have negotiation seminars for women that are sort of academic or mid-career or anything like that. I think at every level, this is something that women struggle with. And I think it would be important for something like that to be available to all of us.
And I think there's also, it's not just about women. I don't like to generalize the category of women, because I think the issues become more complicated when you start adding in race and ethnicity, for example. So, right. So what are the stereotypes? What are the expectations of women of color? How will they be received if the person they're negotiating with is a white man, for example? There's so much that has to be factored in here. But yeah, you're right. And I'm glad you're here, cousin, because I when I looked at the data on physicians, I thought, oh no, her head's going to explode.
It did.
the promising news for people who are interested in the health sciences is that right now at this moment, there are more women in medical school than men, which is for the first time actually historically.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah, but of course, you know this better than anybody. Women go into fields like pediatrics and OBGYN. They do it because they can better juggle work-life balance issues than if they're cardiologists or orthopedic surgeons when they're expected to put in, and because you put in all kinds of crazy hours, even doing the fields that women do.
Yeah, it's a good point, and you're right. We gravitate to a certain profession based on work-life family balance, and that's always factored in 100%. And I think the pandemic has really emphasized and shown the disparities between women and men during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Okay, I have a question from Kelly. I'm not quite sure what this is asking, so Kelly, if you want to come on and clarify, but Kelly says, do your numbers address ability?
I think she's asking whether or not we're talking about the skills that the employees have. In other words, am I comparing apples to apples, that that the skill level of the woman is the same as the skill level as the man? And yes, the numbers address ability. So we're assuming that these are and I'll give you some, many of you probably have heard of the glass ceiling, right? You all know what the glass ceiling is, that women get to about middle management level and in their career trajectories, and they kind of hit their head on an invisible ceiling. They can see above them the senior level positions, but they can't quite get through, right? But you probably haven't heard the term glass escalator. And what the glass escalator is that when men go into predominantly female professions, and I'll give you the example of nursing or teaching, when men become nurses or teachers, they get tracked up the glass escalator into the higher paying side of the job, right? So what that means is that if you are a teacher and you're a man, you're going to quickly be tracked into being a principal or an administrator in some level, because the assumption by both your female colleagues and your male colleagues are that you probably want to be the boss. And we want to track you out of the sort of rank and file women's work of teaching into the more sort of overseer management kind of part of that job. And that's called the glass escalator. Men enter these sort of female predominant professions and get tracked really quickly up the escalator into the better paying segments of that field. So that happens as well. So when you look at a profession like nursing, the numbers where men may earn more in the nursing profession, it may be that many of them are the supervising nurses, and they're tracked into that profession. Other questions?
We have one from Cassandra. Let me unmute Cassandra if she wants to add. I wanted to know, is there a spectrum in wages with different men of color, or are all men the same?
Yeah, so let me go back for a second and screen share the PowerPoint that I had before, because there was one of the slides, bear with me, that shows the pay differentials among men. And let's see, I think it is, saw it here somewhere. So here we go. So this one shows the workers' annual earnings that differ by gender and race. So you can see that white men versus Black men versus Hispanic men, white women, Black women. So there is a spectrum, and it looks like Black men are paid comparably to white women. And then it goes down from there.
The thing that I kind of wonder is how, I know I seen the beginning chart, it was talking about how Asian women out of all women are paid the most. And I find that really interesting. Why is it that Asian women get paid more than white women?
Yeah, I don't really know the answer to that, to be honest with you. I think there are lots of theories about that. I think it may be, I don't really want to comment, because I've seen different studies on this. And if you look at the chart, some of them show them really close. I suspect it has to do with sort of racial proximity to whiteness in some ways. I think it probably also has to do with the professions that some of these women may go into, that may be some of the better paying professions, like technology.
I see what you're saying. I was thinking it wouldn't also be like stereotypes that kind of feed into that, would you say?
Absolutely. So you've got your model minority stereotype, right? So, Asians are thought to be the model minority and that they are better. Again, these are all stereotypes about being educated, being easier to work with, and so on and so forth. That might also feed into that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I think there are some questions in the chat box also.
Yes, there are. So Ginny said, does it have to do with the careers they chose, which I think you are addressing that.
Yeah, it very well might. I mean, I think that does have to do with it, because I think these are aggregate numbers. So the aggregate numbers are across all of the fields. But yeah.
And then how does the pay gap affect trans men and trans women?
So yeah, they are poorly affected. The pay gap for them is even lower than the numbers. And I don't have statistics about exactly their numbers, but they are paid significantly lower. What we do know is that for women who become trans men, they gain status, and for people who are trans women, they lose status. So they fall into all of the kinds of discrimination that trans women will experience, the discrimination that women experience, and then multiplied by other forms of discrimination. They also don't get access to jobs. So their statistics are tragically worse than the things I've presented here today. Other questions or comments or thoughts?
I was going to something like this thinking, I'm like, oh, it's probably not going to be as bad as they're making it out to be, right? But it's always so much worse.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm really fearful of is that the gains that we've made in narrowing the pay gap in the last few years are going to be lost by some of what's happened as a result of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what all the researchers are looking at now. Everyone is watching now. I mean, just hearing that statistic that 270,000 women left the workforce in the month of January, and to compare to 70,000 men, you see what's happening. And as anyone who's ever left the workforce knows, you don't get to get back in where you jumped off. So if you leave the workforce for a year, you're not just losing your place in line for 1 year. The impact is exponential. So it could be that you've just lost 4 years of what you've worked toward. And that is going to be significant as we move forward. I don't know and we know we're entering into some kind of period of economic hardship, right? Of economic, I don't want to say crisis, but we don't know where the economy is. It's still going to be difficult. It's not going to just rebound quickly. It's going to be a long process to get back to the kind of economy we had pre-COVID. I don't know what that's going to mean for the gender pay gap, but I think everybody's got their eye on it right now, because it also points to a talent loss, right? We're losing talent from the workforce. I see a new comment, but I can't for some reason get my computer to show it to me.
It just says this was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Have any of you experienced any of this? No? The sad fact about the gender pay gap, and this, I guess, is a sort of closing note, we often think of this as a woman's issue. It's not. It's a family issue, because if a woman is paid less than what she is capable of earning, what she should be earning, that impact trickles down to what she's able to do for herself and her family. So whether we're talking about a single woman, a single mother, or a mother of a family where there are multiple people contributing to the income, it's not just the woman who's affected. This is a human issue. And I'll just sort of close with that.
Yeah, if we don't have any more questions, that sounds like a good place to leave it. Thank you, Deborah, for all that. I think everybody found it very interesting. It's a very stimulating conversation that we don't get to have very often. So I think that's much, much appreciated. Thank you, everybody, for stopping in, giving us your time. If you enjoyed this program, we are putting on virtual programs all the time. So head to wilmlibrary.org if you want to check out any ones in the future. But I think that's all for tonight. And then again, this is on Facebook if anybody wants to go back and look at anything, see anything they missed. So, all right.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Enjoy the weather.